Chapter 2. Escape in Style. Every once in a while, William and Ellen would hear from other slaves or workmen at the shop about slaves who had tried to get away. Ellen sometimes overheard talk among her mistresses, guessed about niggers who didn't know how well off they were and tried to run away to the north. At times, she heard of the hateful abolitionists who lured slaves away from their good homes and their kind owners. After listening to them, Ellen thought the abolitionists were fearful monsters. When Ellen and William heard of slaves who ran away, they prayed for their safety. But too many were caught. Tracked by bloodhounds and by men on horseback, the poor slaves blundered through forests, stumbled in stony streams, and swam rivers to elude their pursuers. But they were usually caught and brought back. Overseers beat them until they were half dead, as a lesson to others who might think of running away. William and Ellen heard of one slave who had himself packed in a case and shipped north. He was starving and almost suffocated when the crate was opened, but he was free. Sometimes a man tried to escape alone, hoping that when he got up north, he could work and save money to buy his wife's freedom. William was brave enough and strong enough to have taken a chance as others did, in spite of bloodhounds and the fear of punishment. But he would not leave Ellen. He knew he had to think of a plan that would save them both. William often thought that because Ellen could pass for white, she might escape without being caught. She looked like a white woman, and because she had always worked in the house as a personal maid, she talked the way her mistress talked. William had saved more than enough money for the journey. How wonderful it would be, he thought, if he could buy railroad tickets for himself and Ellen. But it was against the law for any public convenience, train, stagecoach, or boat to take slaves without their master's consent. If they were discovered, slave hunters could snatch them from the train and drag them back, but not to the comfortable little room and to the pleasant jobs they had had. As escaped slaves, they would be whipped and put in hard labor in the field, and they might be sold to different masters, never to see each other again. Some escaped slaves had even been tortured to death as a warning to others. How to escape? Would it be possible for Ellen to pretend she was a white lady and have William accompany her as her slave? No, that would never do, because a lady would not travel alone with a male slave. Ladies look only female slaves with them on journeys. 8 days before Christmas, 1848, William thought of a clever and daring plan. If Ellen could be disguised as a young gentleman, he could travel with her as her slave. They could go by train from Macon to Savannah and then on to Philadelphia and freedom. When he told Ellen of this plan, however, she was fearful. "It is too much for us to undertake," she said. She did not think that she could play the part of a free, white young gentleman for the long journey of 1,000 miles until they reached a free state. But after considering the alternatives, remaining in slavery, where she was just a possession, not a human being, and where her children would be possessions of the master, she finally agreed. "God is on our side. With his assistance, we will be able to succeed," she told William to buy the disguise. "I will try to carry out the plan," she promised. Even the purchase of the disguise was difficult. It was against the law in Georgia for a white man to trade with a slave without the master's consent. Still, there were some storekeepers who were willing to sell to slaves, not because they were sympathetic to the slave, but because a slave could never tell on them, since a slave could not testify in court against a free white person. William stealthily went to different parts of town at odd times, buying a coat, a shirt, and a hat for Ellen, and a hat for himself. In this way, he was able to acquire everything needed for Ellen's disguise except a pair of trousers. These Ellen had to sew for herself. Ellen hid all the purchases in the chest of drawers William had made her. There was still one obstacle. In order to travel even a few miles from their home, Ellen needed written permission from her mistress and William from the cabinet maker. Kindly, slave owners sometimes allowed the slaves a few free days to visit family or friends in Christmas, and so Ellen asked her mistress to allow her to visit a dying old aunt 12 miles away. Mrs. Collins consented and gave Ellen the necessary pass. William's employer reluctantly gave William a pass to permit him to accompany Ellen, but urged him to return as soon as possible, as he needed him badly. William promised to do so. Later, the cabinet maker became suspicious, and it was he who ran down the platform, peering into the train windows, looking for them. When William returned to the cottage, he showed Ellen his pass and she showed him hers. They held them as if they were treasures, but they could not read them. They had the precious passes, but there was another difficulty. Ellen suddenly realized that travelers had to register their names in the visitor's book at hotels as well as in the clearance book in the custom house in South Carolina, and her spirits fell. For she could not write. Ellen had wanted to learn to read and write, and her mistress might have consented to teach her. Unfortunately, however, it was against the law to teach slaves to read and write. She and William had taught themselves to recognize and print a few letters of the alphabet, but they could not write even their names. It looked as if William's idea of escaping with Ellen in disguise would never work. Suddenly, Ellen raised her head, smiled through her tears, and said, "I think I have it. I can make a bandage and bind up my right hand in a sling and ask the hotel proprietors to register my name for me." It then occurred to Ellen that the smoothness of her face might betray the fact that she was a woman. She decided to place a bandage on her cheek and tie a scarf under her chin and over her cheeks, as if she were suffering from a bad toothache. But would not her eyes betray her fear? William went to yet another shop and bought a pair of green eyeglasses for her. William and Ellen stayed up all night going over their plans, trying to think of all situations that might arise. Just before the time arrived for them to leave, William cut off Ellen's hair. Ellen then dressed in her disguise. When the moment came for them to leave, William and Ellen blew out the lights and knelt in prayer, begging God to help them escape from bondage, as he had helped the Israelites of old to escape from bondage in Egypt. The decisive moment had come. Once they opened their cottage door and Ellen stepped outside as a young gentleman, there could be no turning back. Fearful that someone might have overheard their plans and be lurking about, William took Ellen by the hand, moved towards the door, raised the latch, and peeped out. The trees around the house were like sentinels. Not a leaf moved. Everything was as still as death. "Come, my dear," William whispered to Ellen. Ellen hesitated, drew back, and burst into violent sobs. After a few minutes, however, she became calm. "Come, William," she said. "I'm ready." William locked the door for the last time and put the key into his pocket, though he knew he would never use it again. Cautiously, they tiptoed across the yard and into the street. There they solemnly shook hands, said farewell, and went separately along different streets to the railway station. William hurried, but Ellen went slowly, as she wanted to get to the station just before the train was due to leave. The journey, which had really begun when Ellen and William were born into slavery, continued. They were now heading towards freedom.